My name's Kevin Lindsay. I work for the School of Advanced Leadership and Tactics, SALT, here at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Today, we're going to discuss the lesson Uniform 509, which is Joint Roles, Functions, Capabilities, and Limitations of the various other services and organizations that the United States Army works with. We're going to examine the strengths and roles, functions, and limitations of the United States Air Force, United States Space Operations, United States Marine Corps, United States Navy and Coast Guard, as well as U.S. Special Operations Forces. We're also going to examine the roles, functions, capabilities, and limitations of other interagency organizations, as well as multinational organizations. We'll finish up today with discussion on the strengths and weaknesses of the Department of Homeland Security. In a moment, you're going to watch a video, and during the video and during our discussion, I'd like you to think about the strengths or the capabilities and the limitations of each of these organizations, as well as the strengths and weaknesses or capabilities and limitations of the United States Army. Because we know the United States Army doesn't fight alone, that we are enhanced and help other organizations complete the missions organized in joint task forces so we can respond to emergencies, crises, or war anywhere in the world to accomplish United States strategic objectives.
I'm Sergeant Ashley Torres. Joint Task Force Haiti Commander Lieutenant General Ken Keene talks about progress in the country.
We delivered over 200,000 bottles of water to the people and over 600,000 rations. And that's just what the Joint Task Force delivered, not including what, of course, the UN forces and all the organizations that are here from the international community. So every day we reach out farther.
Keene says troops have also helped the injured and wounded throughout the local hospitals.
We have troops there that are helping provide food and water to the hospital, and we will be evacuating casualties out of that hospital today, moving them to hospitals in the north part of the country that have excess bed capacity, as well as looking and working with the Minister of Health and discussing all these challenges.
Before we continue on in the lesson, here are some questions to consider. What is one role, function, capability, or limitation of the following? The U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Special Operations Forces, U.S. Space Operations, U.S. Interagency Operations, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security.
The A-10 is one of the meanest machines the U.S. Air Force has. Now it's here at Kandahar Airfield. The mission? Provide close air support of ground forces by attacking tanks, armored vehicles, and other ground targets with a limited air interdiction capability.
The missions we fly in this AO, supporting land forces, I don't think there can be anything better. Every day we're out there with U.S. or coalition forces. We try to provide them with information that they don't have so that they can get through that patrol without being ambushed, so that they can get through there if they are attacked. We can provide an attacking force to neutralize or destroy the enemy forces that are attacking.
Keeping the A-10 up in the air and protecting the troops on the ground requires a lot of manpower, and the crews at Kandahar Airfield make it happen.
The lion's share of folks that came over here aren't guys flying the airplanes. It's all these great guys out here that are working on them. The man hours that go into every sortie, you wouldn't believe. You sit out here and watch these guys work on them for hours and hours on end in the Afghanistan sun. And they're the reasons the airplanes are all ready. They're the reason the airplanes get airborne, and they're the reason we're able to attack targets when we do.
These jets get a checkup during different phases to make sure it's mission ready. But why does it take so many airmen to keep it ready to fly?
There's just so many different components of the aircraft, because you have hydraulics, engines, armament, you have just general maintenance that you need specialized people to break down if you have problems. If phases aren't done every 500 hours and something major goes wrong, then we have one aircraft down plus other aircraft that are possibly being fixed. So the 500-hour phases are more to prevent any major malfunctions.
All the dedication that goes into the A-10, whether it's in the hangar or in the cockpit, ensures the safety of the troops on the ground and puts fear into the hearts of the enemy.
So let's start out examining the roles, functions, capabilities, and limitations of the United States Air Force. Some of the missions, the roles and functions of the United States Air Force are nuclear deterrence operations, of course, air superiority, very important to us Army folks, our ground pounders on the ground, also space superiority and cyberspace superiority also. There's command and control, global, integrated intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions. The Air Force has responsibility for global precision attack. Air Force has some special operations capabilities, and we'll discuss those later. Rapid global mobility, personnel recovery, agile combat support, and they also build partnerships. The U.S. Air Force roles and functions is to organize, train, equip, and provide forces for the conduct and prompt and sustained offensive and defensive combat operations in the air and in space. So the Air Force is the Department of Defense executive agent for space operations. So they provide the launch and the space support for the Department of Defense. They are the executive agency for the space operations. Here's an interesting show showing the evolution of the Air Force from World War II up until today. So during World War II, it took 1,500 B-17 bombers flying over one target, dropping 9,000 bombs to within a little more than 3,000 foot accuracy. Here you can see the target. You can see a picture of the bomber and the bombs that they dropped. Evolving through history up until Vietnam, where it took 30 F-4 Phantom bombers or aircraft flying to one target, dropping 176 bombs with a greater degree of accuracy. Now we're looking at 400 feet instead of over 3,000. Then let's look at Desert Storm, where we have one aircraft, the F-117, two targets, dropping two bombs within 10-foot accuracy. Up until today, where we have one B-2 bomber can drop 80 bombs on 80 targets within less than 13-foot accuracy in all weather. So that shows somewhat of the evolution of the Air Force throughout history.
The Sergeant Major of the Army, Sergeant Major Kenneth Preston, has a message for soldiers and their families.
Not too long ago, the only way to correspond with a soldier serving downrange was through the postal system or an occasional phone call. But times have changed. Through the use of social networks, digital photos, and video sharing sites, our families and soldiers share information faster than ever. However, technology can be a double-edged sword. Our adversaries are trolling social networks, blogs, and forums, trying to find sensitive information they can use about our military goals and objectives. Therefore, it is imperative that all soldiers and family members understand the importance of practicing good operations security measures.
Soldiers can visit the OPSEC Support Element page on AKO for tips and ideas on keeping sensitive information safe.
Today, the Air Force works with cyberspace superiority, not just the airspace, the physical airspace, but also cyberspace throughout the world. So here's the Department of Defense definition of cyberspace. It's a global domain within the information environment consisting of the interdependent network of information technology infrastructures, including the internet, telecommunications networks, computer systems, and embedded processors and controllers. So as you examine from your common knowledge about what the Air Force has, they have global airlift support, they have huge aircraft that can help transport us in the United States Army anywhere in the world, but what would be a limitation of the United States Air Force with all of their missions that they have to do? How about runways? Aircraft have to have runways thick enough and long enough to support aircraft that haul our tanks, our infantry, our supplies throughout the world. Some of the Air Force's aircraft are extremely expensive and have to have a large contingent of maintenance folks that go with that aircraft anywhere in the world. So think of some of the other things, some of the other limitations that the Air Force has when they are conducting joint operations with the United States Army.
Good day. I'm Major Edward Zimbinski from School of Advanced Leadership and Tactics. Part of your 509 lesson, I'm going to talk to you about the United States space operations, what the roles are, what their capabilities are, what their limitations are, and the function of the United States space ops community. There are 4 significant space mission areas when you're looking at either the Air Force as the DoD executive agent for space, or you're looking at the U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Command, or the Navy space operations. Every DoD agency, Navy, Air Force, Army, even the Marines, they've all got their own space operations people, and they all focus on these different areas of space operations. So you have space support. Space support deals with how we actually get our satellites, get our space vehicles into space. And that covers, space lift operations, satellite operations, all those different functions within space support. You've also got space control that focuses around offensive and defensive space control, and also space situational awareness. As far as space situational awareness goes, that is knowing what is happening in the space environment right now. Not only do we have our operating satellites in space, the International Space Station, space vehicles, there's also a lot of junk up there, a lot of debris, either man-made or natural, because we do have space debris that wasn't created by us, rocks, shooting stars, you see meteorites, where are they coming from? That is also debris that can be in orbit around the Earth. The final area, and this is the one that I'm going to focus on, is Space Force enhancement. Now, Space Force enhancement is of particular concern to officers within the United States Army and other DoD agencies, because we use all these areas of Space Force enhancement, and they enable the warfighting functions that we employ in offense, defense, stability ops, and DISCA operations, defense support to civil authority. Those areas of Space Force enhancement are missile warning, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Now, I know that we have updated the Army's terminology to reconnaissance and surveillance, but in the joint community, it's still ISR. There's environmental monitoring, satellite communications, or SATCOM, as most of you have heard, and there's also space-based positional, navigational, and timing, or as most people would know it, GPS. All right, so those are the 4 space mission areas: space control, space support, Space Force enhancement, and Space Force application. We're going to concentrate on Space Force enhancement and how that enables us as a warfighter. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is the value of space. And not particularly what it's bringing you to the fight, but I'm going to talk about what the world would be like if you didn't have space, to show you how much you do rely on it in your day-to-day operations, whether in garrison or deployed downrange. So if you did not have space, you would not have any GPS.
The question of one's position on the face of the earth has challenged mankind for generations. The invention of the chronometer in the 18th century, a highly accurate timepiece, allowed the British Navy to rule the seas. Today, highly accurate atomic clocks are the heart of every satellite of the global positioning system. This constellation of satellites in medium Earth orbit provides position, navigation, and timing capabilities to both civilian and military users around the globe. In recent operations, GPS has shown its potential as a significant force multiplier.
You can forget about your FBCB2. You can forget about your Blue Force Tracker / Friendly Force Tracker. You can forget about your Plugger, your Dagger, your EPLARs. You can forget about Excalibur. You can forget about all your GPS-guided munitions. All of that, gone. You're back to a map and a compass. You also wouldn't have any SATCOM.
Long-distance satellite communications are one of the earliest applications of space capabilities to military operations. Today, by enabling forward-deployed forces to reach back for support, SATCOM has allowed smaller forces to achieve disproportionate effects on the battlefield. Air Force Space Command operates the MILSTAR Secure Satellite Communication System. These hardened, cross-linked satellites are highly survivable and provide critical communications to strategic and national command users. Space Command performs satellite operations for the Defense Satellite Communication System, or DISCUS. While the Air Force flies the bus of the DISCUS satellites, the Army manages the payload. DISCUS provides wideband, long-haul satellite communications between DoD teleports. Recent operations have highlighted the growing need for even more satellite communications. New systems and over-the-horizon operations have created larger demands. A significant amount of defense satellite communications now travel over leased channels from commercial companies.
Now, me, when I was downrange over in Afghanistan as part of an SFAT team, I was having to operate off of SNAP. That was our communications. That was our phones. That was our computers. Well, we relied on SATCOM. If I lost SATCOM, if I didn't have the ability to talk to a satellite in orbit, forget about it. I didn't have any comms anymore. They were all gone. There were no landlines running where I was in Afghanistan. We would not have communications except for the use of cell phones because they operated off of towers. So you can imagine if you lost SATCOM, what that would do to you in whatever type of unit you're in, whatever kind of operation that you're running. No space-based ISR. How many people get on Google, type in an address, and take a look at Google Earth? Everybody wants to see, what does this neighborhood look like? What do the roads look like? Doing a map on there, going from point A to point B. We look at Google Earth constantly. Well, that is space-based ISR. Those are pictures that we're getting from space, civilian companies that are taking that imagery with their satellites, and that ends up on Google, and that's how you're able to look at a picture of your house on Google Earth. We also use it highly in the Army, as you all well know. Well, if you didn't have space, you wouldn't have that space-based ISR anymore. You also wouldn't have any space-based weather, terrain, or environmental monitoring.
They are the sentinels against the storm, our unseen protectors, watching us, warning us about dangerous, even deadly weather here at home and across the planet. 3 U.S. agencies, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Department of Defense, and NASA, have joined forces to create a pioneering satellite-based environment and climate watch system the people of yesteryear could scarcely imagine.
All that stuff that the Weather Channel produces, all those other weather forecasts, Weather Bug and AccuWeather and all the rest, when we know Hurricane Katrina is coming in, when we know Superstorm Sandy is coming in, when we're predicting the paths of storms and what their impact is going to be and, trying to track them, all that is coming from environmental monitoring that's in space. You have satellites that are looking at the entire globe and are also looking at a much more localized picture. All that information goes right back down to the ground so that meteorologists can go over that information and predict the weather better. You'd lose all that. Forget about it. You don't have it anymore. Weather balloon's the best thing you're going to have. That and opening a window. Last thing, you'd lose all space-based missile warning. There'd be no more DSP, no more whistle warning, no more JTAGs. You wouldn't have any of those feeds. You lose a significant advantage when you don't have any space-based missile warning.
Roger, I have tracks building in Iran, multiple destinations.
Track 0129, Power of Iran. TBM attack. I repeat, TBM attack.
TBM attack. Okay, TBM attack. TBM attack.
US missile receiving data, sir.
22 copy. The flying tail is valid for 3 objects.
Okay, Rocksteller, die Kanister ist aufgerichtet werden!
Engage order on 2104. 2104. Engage.
Fireball, fireball, fireball. Track number 80077.
Firing in 3, 2, 1. Eagles Way, track number 6423.
We have a launch alert. Second launch detected. Roger, confirm multiple launches. FBXT picked up 2 launches.
DSP has the track initiating FDFR.
Space confirmed, still phenomenology verified.
PACOM. PACOM, this is the Air Operations Center. Calling to confirm a launch in the PACOM area of operations.
Copy. Missiles inbound from North Korea.
Roger, we're tracking the same.
Patriot should be able to take this.
Make sure that they verify this missile count here.
Positive kill on first shot, sir.
Is THAAD able to engage that threat?
1001 has battle space, engaging track 1001.
Launch alert, launch alert. Third launch detected. Impact location, Sea of Japan. FBXT now has the 4th shot. We show strategic launch, impact location, CONUS.
Aegis is tracking the 2 launches.
This is Lake Erie. Fireball, fireball, fireball. Track 6416.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Eagle away. Track 6416. Over.
X-band platform is queued.
Cobra Dane is now picking up that strategic shot. 2 GBIs assigned to strategic launch.
Director BA intend to engage with GBIs. 1 from Greeley, 1 from Vandenberg.
So anyway, at this point, let's move on to some of what the capabilities of space are and, kind of what the capability is, what's the limitation. All right, as far as strategic capabilities go, because we've talked about the strategic level a lot in this class, they've got global access. You don't have the problems with geographical boundaries or overflight restrictions. It's not like aircraft. Anyone who knows about the Cold War, knows about U.S.-Cuban relations, knows about the U-2 incident when one of our planes got shot down over Cuba, doing an overflight, taking pictures. There are boundaries. You can't fly over everybody's country. There are no boundaries when it comes to space, and there's good reason for that. So satellites are able to fly over every bit of the Earth's surface at one time or another. So you don't run into those restrictions as far as coverage goes. Also, depending on the type of orbit that a satellite has, you have global coverage, either intermittently or up to basically a third of the globe that satellite can keep constant eyes on. It's persistent. You put a satellite in orbit, it's in orbit. You don't have to refuel it or anything else. It's there. Now, this is a generalization, of course. Like everything else, there are forces at work and there's station keeping that needs to be done with satellites. But as you know, GPS is up there. You can turn on your GPS today, tomorrow, next week. Those satellites are up there. All right, I'm going to talk about the operational level now and how that affects space, or what it brings to the fight at the operational level, which many of you will soon find yourselves at in brigades, divisions. It gives you that GPS support, what I called position, navigation, and timing earlier. It gives you support to combat search and rescue. I always like to tell my students when you're talking about space, there is not a soldier over in Afghanistan right now that isn't relying on 2 pieces of Space Force enhancement constantly. Walk up to any soldier on any FOB, and you're going to find their personal locator beacon, their PLB, that operates off SATCOM. You're going to find a GPS on them. That operates off of position, navigation, and timing, our GPS satellite constellation. So the youngest private, a 17-year-old private, 6 months in the Army, sitting on the ground in Afghanistan right now in Kunar or Kandahar or Marja, has at least 2 pieces of space tech on them. We've gone over the environmental monitoring. We've gone over the reach-back communications as far as SATCOM goes, how we use that for computers and telephones. All that's going over SATCOM. If you're sitting here in the U.S. and you call over to Europe right now, you're doing that using a satellite relay. It also gives you that space and terrestrial-based ISR at the operational level, the ballistic missile warning, and also space launch and satellite control would be considered at the operational level, but as Army leaders, at this time, not that critical to you. All right, lastly, as far as space goes, I'm going to talk about what some of the limitations are. All right, at the strategic level, it's constrained by the law of physics. There are orbits when it comes to satellites. You put a satellite up in orbit, it's there. We have some fuel, you can do some small tweaking to a satellite, but you can't just fly it wherever you want to over the globe and it just sits there hovering. That's not the way that it works. It's in an orbit. Satellites, the moon, anything that's in orbit around the Earth is constantly falling towards the Earth's surface. It has to maintain the orbit that it's in. So you don't get the control over, I want it to go park it over Massachusetts and it just sits there. I want to park it over Europe or Asia. Doesn't work that way. You have limited base Space Force application capability. Now, Space Force application, that was that offensive and defensive space that I was talking about earlier. That's very, very limited. It's also very expensive to develop and launch. At this time, you know, what you spend on a satellite to put it up into orbit, to develop it, to get it there, to do your station keeping and do the operations, because you have a ground team talking to that satellite, it's expensive. You can't just throw up another satellite anytime you need it. In the near future, people are working on right now being able to, you know, get that to a point to where you actually could field satellites a lot more quickly. But for right now, this is a strategic operational level asset. So you need to think about that. You need to realize you're using the areas of Space Force enhancement that exist. You're not just going to get something fielded for you and put on orbit. Maneuverability versus lifespan. I've already sort of talked about that. You can do a small amount of station keeping with a satellite, but they don't have a lot of fuel on board. You can't go firing them up and doing some huge long burn and changing the orbit on a satellite. It just doesn't work that way. You need that fuel so that you can keep it on orbit where it's at. Limited assets available. Like I said, these are strategic level assets. GPS is getting pushed to you. SATCOM for your personal locator beacon, that stuff's available. But as far as the big ticket items go, the big areas of Space Force enhancement, they're limited. There's only so much that's out there. We can't field a satellite for every single soldier under the sun, every commander under the sun. There's also the asymmetric vulnerability and the predictability of orbits. That's the last part of this I'm going to talk about. Remember I said how much space junk there was up there right now. You know, there's tens of thousands of pieces of debris flying around in orbit around the Earth right now, either man-made or natural debris. And if an object traveling at, 20,000 miles an hour in one direction runs into your satellite traveling 25,000 miles an hour in an opposite direction, it's going to take out your satellite pretty quickly. Historical example for you, back in, I believe it was 1981-82, the space shuttle was launching, got up on orbit. A speck of paint ran into the windshield of the space shuttle. Just a little speck of paint put a bullseye in that windshield. Thankfully, it didn't break, and the space shuttle landed safely, but that was just a speck of paint. Imagine what a nut, a bolt, or something larger could do to your satellite. It'd be a catastrophic kill, and you'd lose it, and there's not much you can do about it. So, anyway, in conclusion, space, this is an area that we rely on constantly in the Army. Everyone relies on GPS. Everybody relies on SATCOM. Everybody relies on missile defense, environmental monitoring, and that surveillance and reconnaissance you get from space-based platforms. But those areas of Space Force enhancement help you with all of your warfighting functions. And it's not just us. The Navy needs it, the Marine Corps needs it, the Air Force needs it. All those other agencies need it in the joint community. So you need to be cognizant that you are relying on all these space-based assets so that when you go forward in the fight, when you're dealing with other joint forces, you're thinking about not everybody has the same space tech I do, not everybody relies on the same space systems, and I can't get whatever I want. No one's just going to give you whatever you ask for as far as space goes. So you need to know what the limitations are so that you don't have unrealistic expectations when you get downrange. Now, my contact information will be at the end of this presentation on ZU-509. I'm a qualified space operations officer with the U.S. Army. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, call me. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Gentlemen, we now have further intelligence on the escalating crisis in Atlet City, Africa. Terrorists armed with anti-aircraft batteries have taken control of the local civil airport. International food shipments continue to be hijacked and citizens of the region are experiencing brutal attacks. International news coverage reports of widespread famine. The terrorist group has established an extensive training camp 25 miles west of Atlet City. This camp includes a fortified underground bunker that houses their command center and weapon depot. This week, the situation has reached a critical level in Atlet. Support and aid in the region is required immediately. We must act now. Thousands of lives depend on it.
hard work, the local government has regained control. Ports are once again open, providing food, medicine, and supplies to the population. Together, local police and Alliance Corps forces are providing security in the region. This is evident from the troops distributing food and GPS-guided unmanned aircraft systems patrolling the streets from above. The elections, previously postponed due to the crisis, will now take place in 3 months.
U.S. Marines with 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, and other supporting units conduct amphibious assault training aboard Onslow Beach, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina on May 18, 2013.
Purpose, more importantly, is to make sure that we're blocking and tackling to get ready for what we do. And as you know, that's the Marine Corps' expeditionary, and make sure we're part of that Marine Corps Navy team, but it's basic blocking and tackling. It's the basic steps of ship-to-shore movement. It's the basic step of planning. It's the basic steps of loading.
After coordinating with Navy personnel, the Marines were able to depart Onslow Beach using amphibious assault vehicles, or AAVs, and landing craft air cushions, or LCACs, to board the USS Bataan to stage for the training.
Or the exercise that were involved will be us assaulting the beach and embarking on the ship and debarking, you know, just how they used to do it back in World War II, the Pacific Campaign.
Once staged, the Marines began conducting rehearsals consisting of egressing from the AAVs in preparation for the next day's assault.
We did our rehearsals overnight, we did our pre-planning and issued the order, and now we're just standing by in the staging area on the Bataan in order to get on the AAVs and float back to the staging area, drop non-essential raid personnel, and then attack the LZ.
With the USS Bataan 4 miles away from the projected landing zone, or LZ area, 7 AAVs consisting of squad-sized landing teams from 1-8 drive towards the shore to secure the LZ.
Really getting the Marines back into this amphibious mindset. A lot of them haven't done it before. 1 out of 43 in the platoon has done it. Just trying to train the squad leaders and train the team leaders in order to push the Marines to do a good job and execute the mission at hand.
Once at the LZ, the Marines egressed from the AAVs and secured a 360-degree security perimeter and completed the training.
We may or may not end up to go on ship right now in the near future, but that's okay because there's people here that gain some knowledge, get some smart people working that can share that with the division, with MLG, with the battalion, and with the other battalions. And I think that's where we're better off from this experience.
As the Navy Marine Corps team revisits their roots in amphibious exercises, 1-8 can use this training to prepare themselves for future operations abroad.
Now let's look at the roles, functions, capabilities, and limitations of the United States Marine Corps. Here are some of the roles and functions of the United States Marine Corps. Of course, there's seizure and defense of advanced naval bases, security support, which supports naval bases, stations, and embassies throughout the world. They establish amphibious operational doctrine and other duties as the President may direct. I want you to think about this question, are they a second land army? Is that one of the roles and functions of the United States Marine Corps, to be a second land army? Core competencies. Here are the things that the Marine Corps does, and they do very well. They conduct persistent forward naval engagements and to be prepared to respond as the nation's force in readiness. So they have ships loaded with Marines, loaded with supplies, ready to sail to anywhere in the world. They employ integrated combined arms across the range of military operations and operate as part of a joint or multinational force. So they have the self-sustaining, they have their aircraft, they have their ships, they have their supplies, their weapons, and their manpower to support their missions. It's the combined arms. They have tanks. They're a self-sustaining, self-fighting force that can go anywhere in the world, prepackaged on those ships. They provide forces and specialized detachments for service aboard naval ships, on stations, and for operations ashore. The Marines have been very good historically about conducting joint forcible entry operations from the sea, and they develop amphibious landing force capabilities and doctrine, and they use those capabilities throughout the world. They conduct complex expeditionary operations in the urban littorals, which is close to the water, and other challenging environments. And they lead joint and multinational operations and enable interagency activities. So that tells me, it should tell you, that the Marines work with other agencies, multinational organizations, as well as with the United States Army. So here, let's look at the types of Marine Air-Ground Task Force. The largest is the Marine Expeditionary Force. It's the largest standing principal force of the Marine Corps, and they have 3 of them. As we work down in scale, now we have a Marine Expeditionary Brigade. It's an intermediate-sized unit capable of independent operations, capable of forced entry, and it acts as a joint force enabler. The next size below that is a MEU, a Marine Expeditionary Unit. It's forward deployed, it's got forward presence capable of projecting power and responding to small-scale crises. And of course, there is the Special Purpose Marine Air-Ground Task Force that can be task organized depending on what the crisis is or what capabilities are needed. So right now there are 3 standing Marine Expeditionary Forces. The smaller ones, the Marine Expeditionary Brigade, the MEB, the Marine Expeditionary Unit, the MEU, and a Special Purpose Marine Air-Ground Task Force, are task organized from one of the 3 standing Marine Expeditionary Forces. So they, meaning the planners in the Marine Corps, can tailor-make and tailor-size packages to respond to any crisis in the world. Here's a size comparison to help you understand what the size of a Marine Expeditionary Unit is. The United States Army has brigades. An Army brigade is about 2,500 soldiers. Now, a MEU is also about 2,500 Marines. A Marine Expeditionary Unit is comparable then to an Army brigade. So here are some of the missions a MEU, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, are able to handle. These are the capabilities. Of course, amphibious assaults and raids, maritime interception. They have their own aviation, so they can use aviation forces for expeditionary aviation operations. They can do humanitarian assistance. There's NEO missions, which is non-combatant evacuation operations. The MEU can be used to conduct stability operations, working with other forces in joint or other multinational combined operations. They can do trap missions, which is the tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel. And they have special reconnaissance and special operations missions also in the Marine Special Operations Forces, and we'll look at those a little bit later. So here we're looking at what the largest organization, the Marine Expeditionary Force. It's commanded by a lieutenant general. So looking at the limitations of a Marine Expeditionary Force, you can see that they have about 60 days worth of supplies. Now many of these are prepackaged so they can resupply their Marine Expeditionary Force. It's a large force. Here's the intermediate one. We're looking at the Marine Expeditionary Brigade, commanded by a brigadier general. Some might say their limitation is the 30 days of supplies that they have to support the 4,000 to 16,000 Marines, depending on how large and task organized it is. The MEU, remember, that's the one comparable to an Army brigade, anywhere from 2,000 to 3,500 Marines, commanded by a colonel, and some might view its limitation as the 15 days of supplies that it's capable of sustaining operations until it needs to be resupplied. May be a limitation in some environments. Now we're going to discuss the United States Navy, and along with it the United States Coast Guard, because they both deal with water and floaty things that go on the water and around the world. So we'll kind of combine the United States Navy and Coast Guard. Department of Defense Directive 5100.1 directs the Navy to conduct their functions. So from that, then the Navy has been tasked to do general naval supremacy throughout the world, control all the vital sea areas, establish and maintain local superiority close to the United States, seize and defend bases. Another function of the United States Navy is to conduct land, air, and space operations. Now, if you remember from the prior discussion about the United States Air Force, they are the executive for space operations, but the United States Navy also supports space operations as well as other branches. Our Navy cooperative strategy involves forward presence throughout the world. It provides a deterrence, even through nuclear missile deterrence, sea power, power projection throughout the world, maritime security, and it also is a great asset to provide humanitarian assistance and disaster response. So in forward presence, as we send the fleet, we meaning the United States, as we send the fleet throughout the world, it operates forward and gets familiar with areas throughout the world. It can conduct counterterrorism and combat terrorism throughout the world, far from our shores, from the United States, keeping us safe. Now let's talk about deterrence as far as the United States Navy is concerned. It's viewed as a global, regional, and transnational terms for the United States Navy. Everything to deter war through the strategic use of nuclear missiles launched from submarines to sending the fleet forward to make a visual presence to any nation that thinks about disturbing the peace. May have a large deterrent effect as they see warships sitting out on the horizon of the sea, or know that there are nuclear submarines with nuclear missiles capable of launching anywhere in the world. May be a deterrent effect for any of these nations. Sea control is another one of the missions or functions of the Navy, to operate freely at sea anywhere in the world. And not just at sea, not just at the water portion, but also in space and cyberspace. Freedom to maneuver, free to travel about our lines of communication, freedom of access anywhere in the world, to include space and cyberspace. The United States Navy also conducts maritime security. That includes piracy, anti-piracy rather, narcotics smuggling, not that it does narcotics smuggling, but it's counter-narcotics smuggling, decreases human trafficking, against weapons proliferation, it checks out environmental disasters and preparedness. These missions occur in both peacetime and war. And the United States Navy is also great at humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. They have these cool big ships with a nice big red cross on them that can steam anywhere with water deep enough to support them. These hospital ships make a great presence for the United States as they steam into an area in the world that has suffered a national disaster to provide humanitarian assistance. They provide medical support, help airlift patients to and from to get medical support. They airlift supplies to the disaster area just to alleviate human suffering. Some of the other missions the Navy has, they have a special operations. We'll talk more about that in Special Operations Forces. They do aerial refueling, mine laying. They provide close air support with their aircraft to ground soldiers like you and I. They also have space support, and they do strategic lift capabilities. So let's talk about the limitations of the United States Navy. If you look on a globe or an area of the world map, there are certain strategic choke points that ships are hard to pass through. It's narrow landmass, or narrow water rather, with landmass on both sides. We could equate it to restrictive terrain if you want to talk about it in Army terms. So that even though they have the capability to steam nuclear-powered ships throughout the world and without having to refuel, some of the limitations are the water depth, the closest to the shore. United States Coast Guard serves under the Department of Homeland Security instead of the Department of Defense. Only in wartime will the Department of Defense control the United States Coast Guard. Some of the roles and functions of the United States Coast Guard is to guard and protect the ports, waterways, and coastal areas of the United States, drug interdiction. They provide aids to navigation. They conduct search and rescue. They do marine safety, conduct defense readiness. They mitigate interdiction. They provide law enforcement for the coastal areas and the waterways.
The U.S. Coast Guard, America's shield of freedom. The hallmark of our operations, beginning with the establishment of the Revenue Cutter Service in 1790, has been Homeland Security. In the days following the terrorist attacks of September 11th, the Coast Guard, America's most unique and responsive military service, answered the call of our nation. The largest Homeland Security operation since World War II. Hundreds of cutters, aircraft, and small boats, manned by thousands of Coast Guard, active duty, reserve, and auxiliary members, guarded the nation's coast. The Coast Guard responded with port security units and other resources to New York and around the country to secure our nation's 361 ports. Coast Guard national strike teams were also in New York. They were instrumental in neutralizing the anthrax threat in Washington, and they provided hazmat protection for the Winter Olympics. Over 100 security zones were identified around the country, the most in our maritime history. High-risk facilities such as airports, dams, nuclear power plants, and offshore facilities. Protection zones were established around Navy and cruise ships. The challenge is to secure our ports, harbors, waterways, and 95,000 miles of shoreline, while keeping commerce vital to our economy in motion. 95% of America's overseas trade moves by sea. To keep America's commerce moving, the Coast Guard boards high-risk vessels, physically inspecting the ships and their crews with armed boarding teams. The Coast Guard, as part of the Homeland Security Department, also works closely with law enforcement and federal, state, and local agencies to develop new initiatives and regulations to enhance the security of our maritime environment. Here's a closer look at the history, foundation, and multiple missions of the Coast Guard that enabled us to quickly adapt to America's new priority, Homeland Security. Modern America was born at the water's edge, and for most of its history has grown up along the coastlines, lake shores, and riverbanks. We have relied on our waters for much of what we need to live and prosper. And for more than 200 years, the American people have relied on the Coast Guard to protect and defend these vast domains and to safeguard lives and property. Today, the Coast Guard, a lead agency in the Department of Homeland Security, is a military maritime multi-mission service committed to protecting America. The strength of our commerce and national defense, the wealth of our resources, and the health of our environment. Indeed, our continuing pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness depend on preserving the safety and security of our maritime frontiers, and this puts the Coast Guard squarely on the front lines. That makes us proud of who we are and the job we do. The sea is a dangerous place, and when trouble strikes, the Coast Guard gets the call. Every 30 minutes, we respond to an oil spill or an accident involving hazardous chemicals. Every 2 hours, we save a life. Whatever the emergency, wherever the need, our familiar orange and blue racing stripe is first on the scene and is how most Americans see us. But there is a lot more to see. Away from the cameras and out of the spotlight, the men and women of the U.S. Coast Guard tackle some of our country's toughest missions in some of the world's harshest environments. First and foremost, the Coast Guard is a military organization, one of the 5 armed services of the United States. While we belong to the armed services community, we are a military service of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. This means that the Coast Guard has a broad range of missions supporting its 5 fundamental roles, which on a daily basis directly affect the lives, safety, and security of millions of Americans. We have served with honor alongside the Navy and the Marine Corps in every major conflict in U.S. history, including Operation Iraqi Freedom. Our cutters accompany battle groups around the world, providing unique expertise for peacetime and wartime operations, ranging from port security to intercepting commercial vessels and enhancing safety. Today, in support of America's war on terrorism, our role in national defense has broadened, both on the international and domestic fronts. As an example, through our active international training program, we help shape emerging Coast Guards the world over. Statistically, commercial fishing is among the most hazardous of all occupations, and recreational boating is second only to highway travel in the number of lives lost each year. But we are steadily improving safety on the water. Our primary focus is to prevent accidents by establishing manufacturing standards for boats and equipment, working with the commercial maritime industry to reduce human risk factors, regularly inspecting the thousands of domestic and foreign flag ships that call on our ports, and providing boat safety training through the Coast Guard Auxiliary. These efforts save thousands of lives and save billions of tax dollars by reducing the need for costly rescue operations and minimizing insurance losses. When an emergency does happen, we are the Maritime 911, the search and rescue experts. We respond to 40,000 calls for assistance each year, and every call is an opportunity to save lives or property, or both. In addition to our rescue efforts on navigable waters, we are increasingly being called upon to respond to inland emergencies, such as flooding and post-hurricane recovery. When it comes to public safety and security, few threats are as dangerous as illegal drugs. And the Coast Guard is proud to serve on America's front line against drug smuggling. Roughly half of the cocaine, heroin, and marijuana targeted for U.S. neighborhoods reaches our shores by boat, along routes through the millions of square miles of the drug transit zone. The men and women of the Coast Guard endlessly patrol the zone, and dozens of times each day risk their lives to inspect suspect vessels. The results are worth it. Together with state, local, and other federal agencies, we are stemming the flow of illegal drugs and helping to keep our streets safe and our young people drug-free. We are also stemming the flow of undocumented immigrants. Illegal immigration is a terrible burden on U.S. social services and a potential threat to national security. It is also big business. More and more well-organized criminals are orchestrating the influx of political and economic refugees, collecting huge fees for smuggling aliens into the U.S. aboard all types of vessels, making the Coast Guard's mission to enforce immigration laws far more complicated and dangerous than ever before. Just as important as shielding the U.S. from drugs and illegal immigration is our mission to ensure the safe flow of maritime commerce. 95% of America's international trade relies on ships and barges. Our waterways have long been an ideal means of moving goods within the country as well. Today, more than a quarter of our domestic trade moves by water, and a single 15-barge tow keeps 870 tractor-trailer loads off America's busy highways. All international and domestic vessels operating rely on buoys, fixed markers, lighthouses, and satellite navigation to ensure safety at sea. There are more than 50,000 of these navigation aids in U.S. waters, forming the largest navigation system in the world, and the Coast Guard maintains it. We also operate precision electronic navigation systems and provide vessel traffic services in the nation's most congested waterways. Whenever winter weather on the Great Lakes brings commerce to a standstill, Coast Guard icebreakers keep ships and other essential materials moving. In both the Arctic and Antarctic, our icebreakers support international scientific missions. And since our International Ice Patrol was created to track the hundreds of icebergs that threaten shipping lanes, not a single vessel has been lost to an iceberg collision. It is all part of our commitment, along with the Maritime Administration and other federal agencies, to do what's necessary to maintain America's world-class maritime transportation system, not only for the commercial industry, but for America's 74 million recreational boaters as well. The paradox of our waterways is that while they are vast, rugged, and dangerous, they are surprisingly fragile. And so the Coast Guard must not only protect people from the sea, but also protect the sea from people. Since the devastating Exxon Valdez disaster in 1989, the Coast Guard has led efforts for stronger regulations to prevent such tragedies. And with our national strike teams and pre-positioned response equipment at the ready, our country is better prepared than ever before to head off environmental disasters and to respond quickly and effectively when accidents do occur. Overfishing has dramatically depleted fish stocks worldwide, forcing fisheries everywhere to find new resources and exploit existing ones more ruthlessly. The U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, which extends 200 miles out from our shores, is a primary target, since it includes some of the most productive fishing grounds in the world. To preserve this important resource, the Coast Guard patrols the more than 3 million square miles of the EEZ, enforcing laws designed to protect both our fishing industry and our marine environment, including the international moratorium on high seas drift nets, devices that indiscriminately kill marine life. These 5 fundamental roles define our organization and guide our missions. They are the core of what we do. But what makes us unique is our people. More than 70,000 military and maritime professionals who, whether serving on active duty or as reservists, auxiliarists, or civilians, proudly continue our long tradition of honor, respect, and devotion to duty. These are teams of highly dedicated men and women, using their training, skills, and intelligence to make a difference, enforcing the law, protecting the environment, saving lives, and keeping vigilant watch. People who give meaning to the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. We are the United States Coast Guard, America's shield of freedom.
Let's look at the Special Operations Forces of the United States, their functions, roles, capabilities, and limitations. Special Operations Forces are inherently joint, meaning they have to get to work with other forces, with other services, with other nations, with other agencies. So inherently joint. They get to train with and work with, conduct operations with all these other agencies and forces. And that's one of the characteristics of the Special Operations Force. They are distinct from, separate from conventional forces. They have a distinct mission. We'll look at some of these later. They're not a substitute for conventional forces, meaning our Army forces have certain roles and functions, capabilities that fulfill the role that they were designed for. Special Operations Forces are designed for certain roles also. And they also have unique capabilities. Let's look at the joint Special Operations Forces that the United States has. If you look specifically at the United States Army, we have the Special Forces, we have the 75th Ranger Regiment, we have Special Operations Aviation Units, PSYOPs teams, or Military Information Support Operations. We also have Civil Affairs, and most of their training is done at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The Naval Special Operations Forces includes SEAL teams, they have special boat teams, SEAL delivery vehicle teams, and most of their training or headquarters at the Naval Special Warfare Center. Air Force Special Operations, they have aviation fixed wing and tilt wing, they have special tactics, they have the unmanned aerial vehicle units, and aviation foreign internal defense, and their headquarters at the Air Force Special Operations Center School. Now the Marines is a relatively newcomer to the special operations community. They have Marine Special Operations Regiment, and they do reconnaissance and special missions, and they train at the Special Operations School. Then we have a joint standing development, training, and exercises headquarters that designs and runs programs to do joint training of our special operations soldiers, sailors, and airmen with conventional forces. So let's look at some of the special operations core activities. Of course, we're all familiar with watching the cool movies on TV where they do direct action. They also do special reconnaissance and counter-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Special operations are particularly adept at doing counterterrorism and unconventional warfare operations, foreign internal defense, or FID missions, SFA, security force assistance. They're adept at counterinsurgency operations, information operations, and military information support operations with PSYOPs. And of course, civil affairs operations is a special operations mission also. So let's look at some of the Special Operations Forces truths. Humans are more important than hardware. Special forces have a high caliber of soldier that it's selected. They undergo a selection process. It takes a lot of time to train them up. They have language capabilities. It takes a long time to learn a second language. The second one is quality is better than quantity. So small unit, highly trained soldiers, Marines, airmen, is better than quantity. Special operations forces cannot be mass produced. It takes a long time to train these soldiers up, Army Special Operations soldiers up. So it takes a long time to train them up, and it's not something you can mass produce like basic training. Competent Special Operations forces cannot be created after emergencies occur. So getting them into the pipeline, getting them trained up, and out to a responsive force is what we need to think about. And most Special Operations forces require non-Special Operations forces assistance. So think about that one for a second, if that's a limitation or if it's a capability. Some would argue that it's a limitation, that Special Operations Forces has to rely on aircraft in the Air Force to transport them around the world. They can't hold and defend terrain for very long. They have to be resupplied. So it takes other joint forces, other services, the reliance upon other nations to help keep them resupplied. Some would argue that that's a limitation. What do you think are limitations of Special Operations Forces?
Right now we're working with the British officers. They bring a different perspective to the class.
Major Michael Burcham has attended the CGSC for 6 months as an intermediate leadership education student. Now he's alongside British troops as part of the Eagle Owl exercise.
Coalition operations that's what we do. A lot of guys have experience working with Iraqis and with Afghan troops, and this is just another example to work with coalition partners.
The relationships we need to garner with the Americans are very important for us. Whenever we go to war, we'll be at war with you, and therefore it's very important. We know sort of more about your culture and how you operate.
The exercise focuses on brigade planning, which these two armies do quite differently.
We're very systematic the way we do it, and they seem to be a little less formal about the way they conduct their wargaming and preparation for offensive operations, defensive operations.
Although we speak the same language, we operate very differently. We'll never have the resources that you have available to you to conduct any operations, and so therefore it's slightly alien to us to operate with so many other aspects and so many supporting arms.
Inside the classroom, they try to bridge the differences, but once they're done for the day, they come together as a real team.
In the class, we focus on what we do different, and then, like I said, where I really get a lot out of is what we do socially in the sports, and the more of that we do, we're not different at all.
Greetings. I am Colonel Mark McManigal, and I'm the director of the School Advanced Leadership and Tactics course. And over the next several minutes, I'm going to do a lead-in for a very important lesson. And the lesson is called Interagency and Multinational Operations. And just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I took over SALT the first week of September of 2013. And prior to that, I spent a year in Afghanistan working with the Afghan National Police at the Ministry of Interior level. And I was an advisor to a 3-star. So I'll refer to some of those key pieces and parts in the lesson and what I encountered over in Afghanistan. And also, when I was in ARCENT from 2006 to 2008, I had the opportunity to be the chief of the Training, Exercise, and Simulations Division, and I had the opportunity to work from Kenya to Kazakhstan, working with lots of coalition, doing joint exercises. So I'll be able to share some of those experiences with you as I go through the lesson. So what I like to do is just go ahead and get started. And first of all, I'd like to just say that one of the most important things we have to be aware of are all the pieces and parts in reference to a unified action. And as you can see on the chart there are several of them. And some of the key players, of course, are the joint forces, i.e. the Army, Navy, Marine, Air Force, and Coast Guard. Also multinational forces. And again, as I mentioned to you in my last assignment in Afghanistan, I had a great deal of opportunity to work with the multinational forces there from over 40-some countries. And then, of course, you have the intergovernmental organizations. You also have the private sector organizations, and then the other U.S. government organizations, such as the State Department, etc. And we'll talk about those key parts within the unified action. But one of the most important players that we have within this organization is that Joint Force Commander. He's got several key roles that him and his staff have to worry about and as part of that unified action. And one of the key things is he's not the lead planner, but he plans these types of operations. He also is responsible for coordinating and synchronizing the operations. And then most importantly, he has to integrate all those key organizations, be it interagency, multinational, into that key important unified action. Especially if he's working with other entities such as governmental, non-governmental pieces. But the key thing is he's going to have to unite all of those organizations under one command. So that's the key thing. And the bottom line is take away from this slide, that Joint Force Commander has a great deal to do. But the key thing is walking away with a unified effort. Next, I would like to just highlight some of the key organizations, i.e. the services that play that key part. Of course, just a quick refresher, we know we have the Army. They have that, of course, that superior land force that we're always concerned about. And again, within the Army, you have the active duty, you have the National Guard, and of course the U.S. Army Reserve that are comprised of those key components of the Army. The Navy, you have, of course, that superior water force, that strategic hull capability. The Air Force, again, the air support piece, but then they have that strategic reach capability. And of course the Marines, the superior assault force, shock the troops, and they're able to hit the ground running fast. And of course the Coast Guard, who worry about the blue, the brown and green water operations. So what I'd like to do is just start taking a closer look at some of these other organizations, what that Joint Forces Commander has to put together. And most importantly here, as you can see on the slide, you have those key roles. And understanding those key roles of those agencies and nations. And again, we all work a little bit differently, but the end state is you have that unified effort or that united effort, be it working in different geographical locations, OCONUS, or even within the state. And then, of course, some other key pieces there. One of them is law enforcement. Some of the functions. We rely on those subject matter experts all the time. And as you can see there, that's one of those key functions that we have to be concerned about. Also need to know what those assigned duties are. Those are responsibilities and those missions from those organizations and from those agencies. So you have to know that going in. And as we continue to dig into some of those differences and roles and functions with the agencies and nations, you have to look at the capabilities. How each one of those organizations will leverage each other's capability. The different culture, the different experience, and the different knowledge. I'll give you an example. When I was in Afghanistan, the deputy minister was charged with a mission to go up in the northern part of Afghanistan to do some negotiations with the Taliban to release some Afghan national police. So I had to assist him in coordinating not only with U.S. forces, German forces, but then he worked within the Afghan National Police and the Ministry of Interior, working with Afghan National Army, working with the governor, working with other organizations within Afghanistan. But again, that is a unified effort for the Afghans, but the Afghans relied on other forces and other agencies to make this coordination come off in the right way and have a very meaningful end state, i.e. the release of those police. The other part I would tell you is the environment. We all operate in somewhat different environments. We operate in different cultures. So knowing those environments that you're going into and knowing the culture that you're dealing with. One of the things that I encountered with the culture and the environment in Afghanistan is you have to have the respect of that lowest individual to the most senior ranking, so you can build that trust and confidence. If you don't know that culture, you don't respect them, etc., what you're going to have is you're going to have some difficulties in those types of operations. And of course, with the agencies and nations, you also have some of those challenges, some of those limitations. And they are, of course, understanding different types of coordination that you're going to have to work through. You're going to have to work through the rules of engagement. You're going to have to understand the different types of language we speak, be it the Army, Air Force, Navy, etc. Even within the Army National Guard Reserve component, we have our own language. We encounter different acronyms. So you have to have an understanding going into that type of operation. And of course is the knowledge. What are you going to be contending with? And of course what you're bringing to the table with that organization. What I'd like to do is transition to the next key part, and it's some of the organizations that you're going to encounter. Specifically, if you look at the bottom of the slide there, the National Guard and U.S. Army Reserve within their own state, they deal with DSCA operations. And again, you encounter a lot of these government agencies from agriculture, of course, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Department of State, but you encounter various different types of organizations within the state that you work in. So you have to be aware of those organizations and what their capabilities are. Now I'd like to transition to the next slide, talk a little bit about the intergovernmental organizations. Again, my experience in Afghanistan, my experience in the Middle East, but most recently Afghanistan, worked with NATO, worked with lots of organizations within NATO, several countries. Also worked with a little bit of the EU, of course ISAF, in support of the operations going on in Afghanistan and various other parts of that organization. So we are all exposed to different organizations, and the key thing is you have to just be aware of what they bring to the table and what those capabilities and limitations are. Some of the non-governmental organizations I worked with in Afghanistan, of course, was the Red Cross, delivering supplies to various organizations, to schools, dislocated civilians, etc. But you have to understand what they are able to bring to the table. And they bring a lot of different perspectives. They do know the population that you're going to be contending with, and they bring a great deal of subject matter experts. In a lot of these organizations, we also must understand what we have to coordinate with and what their capabilities are. And I'd like to highlight some of those as we walk through this next slide. Again, coordination is key. If we do not do that, we're not going to have a successful operation. And you can see some of those key pieces there, understanding what that organization is all about, and then how you're going to work with that local tribe within some organization or some operation you're participating in, or within that small town or that large city that you're going to be working with. And they also, in the multinational piece, everybody, of course, as I stated earlier, could speak a different language, but knowing what their capabilities are and how they do operations. Within some of those capabilities and limitations, they're listed there. And again, as you can see, we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses, but some of those key things that we really want to get after is just knowing what your mission is and all those organizations you're going to be coordinating with when you get in there. Capabilities. In my experience in the multinational operations, I was the Chief of Training and Exercises for 3rd Army, U.S. Army RCENT from 06 to 08. I had the responsibility of putting together a coalition joint task force, combined arms exercise in Egypt, and we had 15 countries participating. We also had all representatives from the joint services. So very large, complex organizations, and you have to be able to know what their interests are, what they want to get out of the exercise or operations, how security works, etc. And here are some of those limitations that we have to really be concerned about. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key things is respect. And as I mentioned, when I was in Afghanistan, when I was either working with the Chai boy or all the way up to the deputy minister, you had to have and represent yourself in a respectful manner. Because if you didn't, then you did not have or gain that respect. It's the same thing if you're working in a small city, a town within the United States or the state of Kansas. You have to have the respect, not only of the organization or organizations you're going to work with, but it's those other pieces and parts that come along with it. And the command structure. One of the big challenges is understanding what your chain of command's all about, who you report to, and when you have to report to them, because they can be very complicated, very challenging, but you have to make sure you understand what that structure is all about. And one of the other important things is the knowledge. The knowledge of your partners is very key. What type of culture, religion, what their goals are, and of course, one of the important things when you're doing those multinational operations is what the rules of engagement are. And I think one of the most important things as we all move from one job to another is, I call it tactical patience. And you have to be patient in how you're working with either one organization, another country, an interagency organization or a multinational, you have to be patient because everybody moves and operates at a different pace. They all have their different goals, and the information and language challenges can be difficult. So I would just tell you, you just really have to be patient when you're conducting these operations. I think General Dempsey says it very well in reference to joint ops, and this is a build slide, so I'll talk just briefly about some of these key publications here. There are 3 of them. They talk about intergovernmental, and you can see the other publication there, also multinational operations. And the key thing here is, as I stated up front, it's a unified effort. And for active duty Army, U.S. Army, National Guard, U.S. Army Reserve, we have to work together collectively. So when you compound putting these other organizations from interagency to multinational forces within our own, it even makes it more complicated. But the bottom line is, as you can see what General Dempsey states, our professional ethos must always embrace teamwork. We've got to be team players. If we don't work together, we're not going to get it done. And it's just not, we got to maintain a pace. It's not, this is going to be a marathon. It's going to go for not only 24 or 25 miles or 30 miles or 50. We're going to have to maintain a very good pace, and we can't outrun ourselves. But the bottom line is, General Dempsey said, is we got to contribute and we got to work together. And as a force, we can do that here and now and in the future. I appreciate this opportunity. I hope you have a great day. Thanks.
The Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, was created in response to the September 11, 2001 attacks, with the primary responsibilities of protecting the United States and its territories from and responding to terrorist attacks, man-made accidents, and natural disasters. With more than 200,000 employees, DHS is the 3rd largest cabinet department after the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security was the most substantial reorganization of federal agencies since the National Security Act of 1947, which placed the different military departments under a Secretary of Defense and created the National Security Council and Central Intelligence Agency. DHS also constitutes the most diverse merger of federal functions and responsibilities, incorporating 22 government agencies into a single organization. Whereas the Department of Defense is charged with military actions abroad, the Department of Homeland Security works in the civilian sphere to protect the United States within, at, and outside its borders. The department's stated goal is to prepare for, prevent, and respond to domestic emergencies, particularly terrorism. The Department of Homeland Security includes the following agencies: the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, Customs and Border Protection, Citizenship and Immigration Services, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or the ICE, United States Coast Guard, Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and the United States Secret Service. The Transportation Security Administration is charged with providing effective and efficient security for passengers and freight transportation in the United States. U.S. Customs and Border Protection secures the homeland by preventing the illegal entry of people and goods while facilitating legitimate travel and trade. Citizenship and Immigration Services is charged with processing immigrant visa petitions, naturalization petitions, asylum and refugee applications, and managing all other immigration functions. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has the primary mission to promote homeland security and public safety through the criminal and civil enforcement of federal laws governing border control, customs, trade, and immigration. The United States Coast Guard also falls under DHS, however their mission is covered in another portion of this lesson. The Federal Emergency Management Agency coordinates the federal government's role in preparing for, preventing, mitigating the effects of, responding to, and recovering from all domestic disasters, whether natural or man-made, including acts of terror. The United States Secret Service, created in 1865 to suppress counterfeit currency, safeguards the nation's financial infrastructure and payment systems to preserve the integrity of the economy, protects national leaders, visiting heads of state and government, designated sites, and national special security events.
So we've finished discussing Uniform 509, the functions, roles, capabilities, and limitations. We talked about the Air Force. We talked about U.S. space operations, United States Marine Corps, as well as the Navy and Coast Guard. We talked about United States Special Operations Forces, interagency, and multinational operations. And we also talked about the Department of Homeland Security. So from all these agencies, what surprised you the most about any of the roles, functions, capabilities, or limitations of any of these agencies we've talked about? So I'm going to ask you to anticipate the future of joint operations. Knowing your history of military operations, United States military operations, how forces have worked together or not worked together in the past, anticipate the future with all the conflict and chaos going on in the world. Can you anticipate what the future of joint operations will look like? Have we as the United States Army learned our lesson to work with others, to play well with the Air Force, to play well with the Marine Corps, to use their strengths to enhance Army operations, and to use the strengths of the United States Army to offset some of the limitations of the other services or nations? What do you think the future will look like for joint operations for you as an Army officer? I'll ask you also to think about you personally. What does your future look like as a United States Army officer working with joint operations? If you're a National Guard officer, do you anticipate working with or being a liaison with perhaps the Air National Guard within your state? How about a state agency within the state's borders? Do you think perhaps you might work a joint operation with a state agency in perhaps a natural disaster or a state emergency at your Joint Forces headquarters or the Emergency Operations Center? How do you think it applies to you as a United States Army officer? That concludes Lesson Uniform 509, Joint Operations, Roles, Functions, Capabilities, and Limitations. Again, my name is Kevin Lindsay. I work for the School of Advanced Leadership and Tactics. We'll put my contact information up here so you can feel free to give me a phone call or send me an email with any questions or anything you want me to consider for future lessons. For the basic, I will refer you back to the Joint Publication 3-0 Joint Operations, which has got, it's a definitive doctrine guide for joint operations, Joint Pub 3-0. Thank you for your service to our nation.